الله الرحمن الرحيم نحمده ونصلي على رسوله الكريم أما بعد. In this episode, we will look at the central role played by the Kaaba in the life of the Prophet ﷺ after Nubuwwah while at Mecca. Let's take a few steps back. We know that the Kaaba was the most important monument and place for the people of Quraysh. The people of Quraysh saw themselves as the upholders, protectors, and those who maintained the sanctity of the Kaaba. This is why they felt that they were the authority to lay down the rules for what happens once people enter into the limits of the Haram. They had called themselves the Hums, which means the passionate upholders of faith and the passionate protectors of the sanctity of the Kaaba. So some of the rules that they had laid down were that anyone coming from outside the limits of the Haram could not bring food from the Hill, from beyond the Haram, into the limits of the Haram. In fact, they were only allowed to consume food that was produced by Quraysh and provided to them by Quraysh. Similarly, they were not allowed to come to the Kaaba with clothes that they had brought with them from outside the limits of the Haram, which meant that they either had to acquire clothing from within the limits of the Haram, again provided by Quraysh, or in the absence of such clothing, they would be required to do tawaf of the Kaaba without wearing any clothes, because the clothing that was from outside of the Haram was not worthy of being worn when inside the Haram, especially during tawaf of the Kaaba. If in some cases a person was not able to acquire clothing there and had no choice but to use clothing from outside, then they would have to dispose of that clothing after they made tawaf. They could never wear that clothing ever again. We spoke about the food, how they were very particular about only food from within the Haram can be consumed. Now, the Quraysh also gave themselves certain privileges. For example, they were allowed to enter into the Kaaba itself, and they could be selective about anyone else who was not from amongst them, who could come in and who could be prevented. Quraysh also felt that it was beneath them and below their honor and distinction to leave the Haram for anything, especially any kind of worship. After all, they had the Kaaba, so why should they have to go outside to worship? This was the reason why they would not go to Arafah on the 9th of Dhul Hijjah, while all the other Hujjaj from the Arabs would go to Arafat. The Quraysh would stay within. The exception to this was, of course, the Prophet ﷺ, who even prior to receiving Nubuwwah, when he performed Hajj, he did go to Arafah. In fact, Jubair ibn Mut'im narrates that he saw the Prophet ﷺ before receiving divine revelation there at Arafat with everyone else. Of course, the Prophet ﷺ was concerned with completing the rites of Hajj as laid down by Ibrahim ﷺ. Nevertheless, the Quraysh had this very strong attachment to the Kaaba. If a woman was having difficulty in her childbirth, for example, if her children were stillborn or they were passing away soon after birth, she would make a vow that the next child I have, if he survives, I will name him Abdul Kaaba. This was the case with Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu also, whose mother frequently lost her children. So she made a vow that the next child I have, if he survives, I'm going to name him Abdul Kaaba, the slave of the Kaaba, or the one who shows servitude at the Kaaba. This was because of their strong belief and commitment to Baytullah. Of course, the child was born and he survived, and this name Abdul Kaaba actually stayed with Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, along with another title that he had, Atiq, which means the one who was freed from the pangs of death and was allowed to live. The Prophet ﷺ had a very strong connection with the Kaaba from the time of his birth. Abdul Muttalib used to have a special seat that was laid out for him right in front of the Kaaba. All his 10 sons would come there. No one but Abdul Muttalib was allowed to sit in that special place. But the Prophet ﷺ would come to visit his grandfather, and when he would come close to that place, his uncles would try to stop him, but Abdul Muttalib would prevent them from doing so, and he would sit the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ beside him and pat him on the head, on the back, and show his great affection for Muhammad ﷺ. After the Prophet ﷺ gained nubuwah, his devotions around Baytullah became even stronger. Prior to receiving nubuwah, we know that he ﷺ used to go for seclusion at the cave of Hira. And there, at the cave of Hira, the Prophet ﷺ would worship. One of the reasons that the ulama have mentioned was that even though the Kaaba was the central place of worship, it was surrounded with idols, and it was difficult for the Prophet ﷺ to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the way that he wanted to. There were too many distractions, too many other activities going on. But ulama have also said that the position of the cave, the mouth of the cave of Hira, is such that a person has direct view of the Kaaba, especially in the absence of all the other tall structures that we see today. So he was actually able to see the Kaaba directly from a distance and worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Whenever the Prophet ﷺ would come back from those seclusions, he would first come to the Kaaba and make tawaf. And this would be usually in the month of Ramadan. And upon his return, he would spend much wealth on the poor and needy people, and he would come back in very good spirits. We know that when the Prophet ﷺ first began to invite his relatives, as per the instruction of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, وَأَنذِرْ عَشِيرَتَكَ الْأَقْرَبِينَ, he ﷺ gathered his family members at Mount Safa, and there he conveyed the message of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that's where Abu Lahab expressed his anger, frustration, and disdain for the Prophet ﷺ and his message. He ﷺ would frequently worship at the Kaaba, and he would normally pray between Al-Rukn al-Yamani and Al-Hajr al-Aswad, facing that wall. And this would enable him to face the Kaaba, but also face Bayt al-Maqdis. It happened there, at that spot, where the people of Quraysh who would see him worshipping would carry out various attacks on him. Abu Jahl once saw the Prophet ﷺ worshipping, and he asked for someone to bring him the innards and intestines of a camel, and had those laid on the Prophet ﷺ's neck, this immense weight and burden on the Prophet ﷺ as he went into sujood. And then his daughter Fatima radiallahu anha came and removed those. Similarly, once the Prophet ﷺ was worshipping in another area, some narrations mention that it was in the area of the Hatim. He was worshipping there, and Uqba ibn Abi Mu'ayt came with some kind of a sheet or a cloth, came behind the Prophet ﷺ and began to strangle him from behind his back, and Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu intervened. There was an occasion when a group of the people of Quraysh, amongst them were Utbah and Shayba and Umayyah ibn Khalaf, Abu Jahl ibn Hisham, An-Nadr ibn al-Harith, all of these leaders of Quraysh asked for the Prophet ﷺ to come and see them. Nabi ﷺ came with the hope that maybe they've had a change of heart and they are ready to listen to his message. But when he arrived there, they had a completely different message for him. They said that you have insulted our our idols. You have ridiculed our forefathers. You have found flaws in our religion. No one has brought more trouble to a community than you have brought to your own community. So we want to know what your motive is. If your intention is to become our leader in the process, then we are ready to make you our leader, but stop this message. If you want wealth, we'll gather our wealth and we'll make you the wealthiest person amongst us, if that's what you're after. And if there is some kind of a problem, a sickness, if you're possessed by a jinn, then we'll find the best treatment and we'll spend our money to get you treated. But you must stop talking like this. You must stop this invitation towards one God. The Prophet ﷺ said, I am not conveying this message for any of the reasons that you are mentioning. I am a prophet who has been selected by God, and I have been commanded to convey this message and invite mankind towards Him, and I have received His book. This is my only mandate. If you accept this, then this is going to be enough for you in this world and the next. And if you reject it, then the consequences will be on your shoulders. They said, okay, if you are truly the messenger of God and He has sent you, then He must have empowered you. He must have given you the keys to His treasures. So why don't you ask Him to change the landscape of Mecca? We're surrounded by mountains. We're kind of trapped within these mountains. Why don't you ask Him to push the mountains away and open up the land for us and make rivers flow like the rivers in Iraq and Sham flow? So ask Him to open up these treasures that you have access to. The Prophet ﷺ said, this is not my mandate. This is not why I have been sent. Again, he repeated his message and he said, if you accept this message, believe me, this will be enough for you in this world and the next. They continued making these kinds of demands. And when the Prophet ﷺ told them that this is not what I have been sent for, they said, okay, fine. Then you tell us that there is a punishment. You tell us you are here to warn us of a punishment if we don't accept. So bring that punishment. Why don't you make the sky fall and crash on our heads? The Prophet ﷺ said, that is not in my control. That is in the hands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Again, I am just here to convey this message. So this built up a lot of frustration. They made all of these demands and they tried to get the Prophet ﷺ to change his position. After this, the Prophet ﷺ left. Abu Jahl was very angry and frustrated, and he said, watch what I'm going to do to him tomorrow. I'm going to take a boulder and I'm going to crush his head while he's praying. So while the Prophet ﷺ came the next day and was praying, Abu Jahl came with this massive boulder, and as he was about to approach the Prophet ﷺ, all of a sudden he threw the boulder and he ran away. And people said, what happened? He said, something came at me. It was like some kind of a giant, ferocious camel or something, and it was going to eat me alive. I don't know where it came from. And they said that, well, we didn't see anything like that. You must be seeing things. Abu Jahl knew that this was a warning from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When the Prophet ﷺ was told that this is what Abu Jahl was trying to do, and this is what happened with him, the Prophet ﷺ said that was Jibreel that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had sent to save me from him. There were many incidents of this sort, many skirmishes and fights. Hamza radiallahu anhu, who was a great hunter, used to go out and hunt for food. Whenever he would come back, he would first perform tawaf, meet all the people that were there, and the Quraysh and the various clans had specific areas around the Kaaba where they would congregate. So he would go and meet them all and then go home. So once when he came back from a hunting trip, as he was greeting people, the slave girl of one of the people told him that you should have seen what Abu Jahl just did with the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. And she told him that Abu Jahl had come and he had insulted the Prophet ﷺ and said all kinds of nasty things. So Hamza radiallahu anhu was very upset. He walked over to where Abu Jahl was sitting with his people. He still had his bow with him that he had gone hunting with, and he took that bow and struck Abu Jahl on the head and injured him. And he said, "What are you going to do now? I am his follower also. I believe in what he believes in. Do something if you can." Of course, no one had the courage to stand up to Hamza radiallahu anhu. This was a major boost for the Muslims. The Muslims were very strong and courageous after this, and Quraysh stepped back their efforts in trying to hurt the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The Kaaba was also the place where the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam would sit with people and have conversations about deen with them. A delegation of some 20 Christians, educated religious Christians, came to the Prophet ﷺ. They had heard news from Abyssinia about the Muslims that had gone there and what kinds of practices they had and who their prophet was, and the reaction of Najashi to the Prophet ﷺ's message. So they came to learn about this. So the Prophet ﷺ spoke with them. He gave them da'wah. They accepted Islam. Of course, Abu Jahl was extremely upset that these people just came to ask questions and they walk away accepting the religion of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. Similarly, you would have heard of the story of Tufail ibn Amr ad-Dawsi, who came for Hajj, and people had warned him that there is a man here called Muhammad and he leads people astray. He says all kinds of things. He is a magician, so make sure you don't listen to him. Tufail was initially very scared about this. He did not want to be exposed to this type of message, so he plugged his ears with cotton. Then when he came to the Kaaba, he saw the Prophet ﷺ standing there and reciting Quran in his salat, and he asked himself that, Tufail, you're an intelligent person, you're a poet yourself, can't you differentiate between poetry and the words of magicians and the words of a prophet? So just listen to what he is saying and then decide for yourself. No one can force you. So he unplugged his ears, he listened to the recitation of the Prophet ﷺ in salat, and he immediately came to this conclusion that these are not the words of a magician or the words of a poet. These words can only be from God. So he spent a few days with the Prophet ﷺ, about 3 days or so, and then he went back to invite his tribe of those towards Islam.